All right, welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
And today we're tackling a figure I know a lot of you are probably already pretty familiar with, Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
But we're going kind of deeper than I think some of the usual stuff,
Right.
The greatest hits, so to speak.
Exactly.
We've got writings by A&D about him this time.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different because we're kind of getting these multiple perspectives all at the same time.
Absolutely.
So if you think you already have Chomsky figured out,
Right.
maybe get ready to think a little bit differently.
Absolutely.
One of the things that's so fascinating to me, and I'd love to get your take on this, is, we always try to box Chomsky in, right?
Yeah.
He's either the linguistics guy
Right.
or he's the politics guy.
Exactly.
But in this material, it's really neat because you see how he himself kind of weaves those two things together.
Yeah.
So he's not just analyzing how we speak, but how that very speech shapes our reality.
Yeah.
And I think particularly when it comes to power.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the things that's so interesting is how his political views really do stem from, or at least informed by, his understandings of language.
Yeah, like it's all connected,
For sure.
It's not just these separate boxes.
Right.
And we know Chomsky was influenced by, folks like Rousseau,
Yeah.
that whole Enlightenment ideal of just society as being a realistic goal.
Right. Yeah.
But you really see those echoes
Yeah.
in his work.
Absolutely.
Even when he's talking about grammar,
Absolutely. Yeah.
it's like he almost believes that we are wired for fairness.
Yeah.
And language is kind of the proof.
Oh, yeah. And that's what's so fascinating about it is, I think in many ways it's more than just proof. It's a tool.
Right.
We could spend all day talking about generative grammar.
Right.
But I think for the sake of this deep dive, we can assume that you all at least know the basics.
Right. You've done your homework.
Exactly.
You came prepared.
But what's so wild is you're reading these essays by Chomsky and you're suddenly finding him quoting these 17th century grammarians.
Oh, wow.
And you realize that these guys were already onto something about the inherent structure of language.
Right.
They just didn't have the tools to systematize it and really prove it the way that Chomsky did.
Right.
They had the intuitions, but not the tools.
Makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what ideas are we playing with now?
Oh, yeah.
That'll seem so obvious centuries from now,
For sure. Totally.
But to bring it back down to earth a little bit,
Yeah.
this whole universal grammar thing,
Yeah.
that always kind of messes with my brain a little bit.
I understand.
Yeah, how can there be these rules for all languages?
Well, think of it this way. Chomsky often uses the analogy of a cat's visual system.
Okay.
How do we understand how a cat sees?
Right.
We can't crack open a human brain and see how it processes language for ethical reasons, right?
Right.
But we can look at how languages across the world share certain features, certain limitations, certain properties.
Okay.
And from that, we can kind of reverse engineer what the system must be like that produces that output.
Okay, that helps a little bit.
Right.
It's like the languages are the clues and the universal grammar is the crime
Exactly.
we're trying to solve.
That's a great way of putting it.
I know.
Absolutely.
But this whole thing about the, this blueprint,
Yeah.
this totally throws a wrench into that old theory
Yeah.
of language is just learned behavior.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the blank slate idea.
Huge wrench. Yeah. The behaviorists would say that we come into the world as blank slates.
Right.
Just soaking everything up through rewards and punishments.
Huh.
Chomsky's like, nope, we've got this blueprint.
Right. And that changes everything
It changes everything.
about how we view ourselves,
Yeah.
how we teach kids,
Absolutely.
everything. Right.
Yeah, from education to our understanding of the human mind itself.
So if we are wired for language, this is a question I've always had. Are we wired for certain kinds of language?
That's interesting.
Because, Chomsky's not just content to stay in the science.
Right.
He's very much concerned with the ethics.
He dives right into the ethics of how this stuff is actually used.
Yeah, and you see this in his arguments about research particularly.
Yeah.
Like, he uses the example of counterinsurgency technology being developed on university campuses.
Right.
It's cutting-edge stuff.
Right.
But could it be used for harm?
Yeah.
And he's like, well, let's keep this research open. Let's debate it. Let's think about the consequences.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, how many fields have those ethical tightropes that we don't even consider?
It's so true.
Yeah.
It's easy to be like, oh, Chomsky, Mr. Anti-Establishment.
Yeah.
But, I think what he's getting at here This is a question for all of us.
Absolutely.
Where do we draw that line between knowledge for the sake of knowledge?
And how that knowledge is potentially used.
Totally.
And I think that brings us to one of his most, I don't know if infamous is the right word, but at least well-known.
Yeah.
And in some circles, very controversial concepts.
Yeah.
The manufacture of consent.
Right. Which, to be fair to Chomsky,
Yeah.
he borrows this term from Walter Lippmann,
Right.
who was writing much earlier in the 20th century.
Yeah.
But, the idea is that public opinion,
Right.
even in democracies, is very carefully sculpted.
It's not just about, silencing dissent. It's about how the information is presented.
Exactly.
Right.
Exact.
Framed in a way that...
It manufactures our agreement.
Yeah, and manufactures our agreement.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Think about it.
Right.
Even in countries that have freedom of the press, we're
Right.
still getting all of our news from a very small handful of sources.
Right.
And Chomsky would argue that those sources, as well as the intellectuals who kind of lend them credibility,
Right.
are often acting as gatekeepers.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And that brings us, I think, to this example that he uses about media coverage of the Vietnam War.
Right, yeah.
Where he basically shows how a completely different picture
Yeah.
was painted for the educated elite
Yeah.
versus just the general public.
Exactly. And so it's like targeted messaging without even having to lie.
Right.
It's all about what you emphasize, what you leave out.
Right.
And this is where Chomsky's analysis, I think, starts to get really unsettling for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because he's basically saying that this manufacture of consent
Right.
is fundamental to how power operates,
Yeah.
not just in dictatorships,
Right.
but also in the systems that we consider free.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Perfect segue
Yeah.
into his views on U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly.
Because, he doesn't exactly pull any punches there.
No, he does not.
Yeah.
He does not. Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head when you said that he doesn't pull any punches. When it comes to U.S. foreign policy,
Right.
He's not just like, oh, I disagree with this policy.
Right.
He dissects it.
Yeah.
And he does it in a way that connects all these seemingly random events
Yeah.
into this kind of disturbingly coherent pattern.
Yeah. You start reading and you're like,
Right.
wait a minute.
Yeah.
Is he saying that the U.S. invasion of Iraq
Yeah.
and banana republics in the 60s are somehow connected?
Right.
And then he lays it all out and you're like,
And then you can't unsee it.
oh my God.
Yeah, you can't unsee it.
It's once you see the pattern, it's always there.
Right. And a big part of that is this idea, I think what he calls the
Yeah.
North-South conflict,
Right.
which is basically his way of saying,
It's his way of saying that powerful nations,
right,
often Western nations,
right,
haven't really stopped being colonial.
Right.
They've just changed their methods.
right. It's gotten more sophisticated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's not as overt anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of the big picture.
Yeah.
But how does that actually play out?
Right.
One of the things that I think Chomsky is most controversial for
Yeah.
is how he talks about what he calls the fateful triangle.
Right.
The U.S., Israel, and Palestine.
Yeah. That's a hot button issue.
He's not exactly winning any popularity contests in Washington, D.C. with that one.
Yeah, he's not making friends in high places with that analysis.
No, but his take, and tell me if I'm getting this right, is that the U.S. support for Israel
Yeah.
isn't just about
It's not just about shared values.
shared value.
Whatever's being said publicly.
Right, right.
He ties it back to those strategic interests, like controlling oil resources,
Wow.
maintaining military presence in the region, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
It's a very different way of looking at it.
It is, and it's one that I think a lot of people find very difficult to accept.
Right, and it's not like he's
Yeah.
letting the Soviet Union off the hook either.
No, not at all.
Right. He's got this whole thing about how the Cold War,
Yeah.
well, it was obviously a very tense time.
Very scary time for a lot of people.
Very scary.
Yeah.
Duck and cover drills. Right,
All 9 yards.
exactly. But he makes this point that, it also kind of served both superpowers' interests.
Right. It's like we grew up with this Soviet Union is evil narrative.
Yeah.
But he points out,
That's
like,
something, right?
yeah, that kind of simplified story actually benefited both sides.
Right.
It kept everyone afraid, it justified massive military spending,
Right.
and it kind of kept the focus off of what either country was doing domestically as well.
It's like the Wizard of Oz.
Exactly.
Brilliant.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Exactly. And on that note,
Yeah.
we've got to talk about how Chomsky defines terrorism.
Yes, we do.
Because he pretty much takes the whole word.
throws it right back in our faces.
And throws it back in our face.
Yeah.
It's such a, it's one of those arguments that once you hear it,
You can't really unhear it.
you can't unhear it.
It changes your perspective.
Yeah, he points out that for centuries, like Europe and the United States were engaging in acts of terror.
All over the world.
All over the world.
But they got to write the dictionary.
Right.
They got to define the terms.
Right.
So they got to decide what counted as terrorism and what didn't.
And it's like all of a sudden you add, colonialism and slavery
Right, exactly.
to the list of things that are terrorism.
Yeah, it makes you realize how subjective that label is.
Right.
And how it's often used to serve the interests of the powerful.
And then on top of that, he connects it to 9/11
Yes.
by saying that, this was a sign.
Yeah, that the West might be losing its monopoly on violence.
Right.
It was a wake-up call in a way.
It's like, this is where you really see his long game thinking.
Yeah, he's not just looking at events in isolation.
Yeah.
He's looking for those shifts in the balance of power.
Right.
The things that signal a changing world order.
I got to admit, it's kind of hard not to get a little paranoid
Right.
reading this stuff.
It can be unsettling.
Yeah, if all this manufacture of consent is going on,
Yeah.
how do we even know what to believe anymore?
I think that's the challenge Chomsky's throwing down, isn't it?
Right.
It's not about him giving us the answers.
Right.
It's about him giving us the responsibility
Right.
to question everything,
Yeah.
to seek out multiple perspectives,
Right.
and to be aware that even the smartest people
Right.
can be manipulated.
It's like he's saying,
Eh.
hey, you're smart enough to get this far.
Yeah.
Now go figure out the rest.
Now do your own homework.
Right.
Apply these tools.
Which is exciting,
It is exciting.
but also a little terrifying.
Yeah, a little bit of both.
Right.
But I think that's what makes it so important, right?
Right.
Because if it were easy,
Yeah.
then everyone would be doing it.
Right. Exactly.
And that brings us to, I think, where the connection between language and power really comes full circle, which is this idea that understanding how language is used to shape our thinking is the first step in breaking free from that manipulation.
So it's not just about being skeptical of the news or whatever.
It's not just about fact-checking,
Right.
being cynical. It's about understanding those deeper structures,
Right.
those patterns of thought that are embedded in the language itself.
That's deep, man.
It is deep.
Yeah.
But I think that's what makes Chomsky so relevant
Right.
even today.
Yeah.
Because he's not just giving us a political analysis, he's giving us a toolkit
Right.
for thinking critically about an on-way system of power.
Right. Whether it's the government,
The media, our personal relationships.
That's a whole other deep dive
It is.
for another time.
Maybe we'll get there one day.
Okay. So before we go down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
let's bring it back to
To Chomsky.
Chomsky's critiques. Yeah.
Mm.
Because one of the things I always find really fascinating is this idea that even in these supposedly free societies,
Yeah.
that there's this undercurrent of conformity.
Absolutely.
We think we're being independent,
Right.
but we're all kind of just swimming in the same school of thought.
Yeah, and I think you're picking up on what Chomsky calls the illusion of choice.
Right. Yeah.
He's got this great anecdote about talking to a journalist who was clearly very disturbed by the lack of independent thought in the media,
Yeah.
but also felt totally powerless to change it.
Right.
It's like that trap that a lot of us fall into, right?
It's so easy to just be like, oh, well, that's just how the world works.
Yeah, that's just the way it is.
But, Chomsky's work is like a giant neon sign flashing,
Wake up.
wake up, this isn't inevitable.
It's manufactured.
It's manufactured.
Yeah.
It's a choice.
Right.
And I think that realization is the first step towards change, right?
Yeah.
He's not saying it's easy.
To break free from these systems, but he kisses saying it's possible.
Right.
And the more of us who start questioning the narrative,
Yeah.
the harder it becomes to maintain that illusion.
That's actually, when you put it that way,
Yeah.
pretty inspiring.
All right.
It's like he's not just pointing out the problem.
Exactly.
He's giving us the tools to dismantle it.
He's saying, look, the system's rigged, but the human mind is even more powerful.
Okay, now I'm really seeing why people call him a revolutionary.
Right.
But
Yeah.
let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Let's not get too carried away.
We've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
from the deep structure of language
To the complexities of U.S. foreign policy.
to U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, and we've only,
And we've only just scratched the surface.
scratched the surface.
Yeah.
I mean, what's amazing is how Chomsky manages to weave all these seemingly disparate threads together
Right.
into this really coherent worldview.
Yeah, it's like he's saying,
If you want to understand the world,
yeah,
you can't just look at the surface.
you got to go deeper.
You got to go deeper. You got to question everything.
Question your assumptions.
I'm willing to challenge
those narratives that are being fed to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's the challenge that he leaves us with.
It is. Yeah.
To become more engaged citizens.
Right.
To think critically about the information we consume.
Right.
And to be willing to speak truth to power.
Yeah.
Even when it's uncomfortable.
I don't know about you.
Yeah.
But I'm feeling pretty fired up right now.
Me too.
Like, I need to go read everything Chomsky's ever written.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know.
Start a revolution.
Start a revolution, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe not a revolution.
Okay, maybe not right now.
Not just yet.
But I get what you mean.
But I get what you mean.
Like, his work really has a way of shaking you
oh, yeah.
out of any kind of complacency you might
It
feel.
forces you to confront the realities of the world we live in.
And to realize that we actually have a lot more agency
We do.
than we think we do.
We have the potential to make a difference.
Right.
And I think that's what Chomsky's trying to remind us of.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here?
I mean, we've talked a lot about all these critiques of the world.
Right.
What about solutions?
Solutions.
Like, what does he offer in terms of hope for the future?
Well, I think he does offer hope, but it's not the kind of hope that comes from easy answers
Right.
or utopian visions.
Yeah.
I think Chomsky's hope is rooted in his belief that human beings are inherently capable of reason,
Right.
compassion,
Okay.
and cooperation.
Okay.
He sees those qualities reflected in the many social movements throughout history that have challenged injustice and brought about real positive change.
So it's not about waiting for some great leader
Right.
or for the system to fix itself.
No.
It's about recognizing that
It's about recognizing our own power.
we have the power to create change.
Exactly. I think Chomsky's work is a call to action.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to become more engaged citizens, to challenge the status quo, and to work towards a more just and equitable world.
Right.
He believes that a better future is possible,
Right.
but it's up to us to create it.
I think that's a perfect note to end on, actually.
I think so, too.
You know,
Yeah.
Chomsky's work, it can be challenging.
It can make it very challenging.
It can be unsettling.
Absolutely.
But it is ultimately, I think, a message of hope
It is.
and empowerment.
I think that's a great way to put it.
He reminds us that we actually do have the power to change the world,
We do.
but only if we're willing to
To do the work.
do the work, right?
To think critically, to question authority, and to stand up for what we believe in.
Well said.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think that's the essence of his message, really.
I think so, too.
Like a call to awaken
Yeah.
to our own power and responsibility.
Absolutely.
And it's a message that I think resonates now more than ever.
I agree.
It's funny, we talk about Chomsky as this, like, radical figure.
Yeah.
But when you really get down to it, like, the core of his work,
Right.
he's just stubbornly clinging to this idea
Yeah.
that humans are fundamentally decent.
It's true.
Like, that's his starting point.
Yeah.
Even when he's analyzing, like, all of this messed up stuff in the world.
It's almost radical in its simplicity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You would think that someone who spends their life critiquing power structures would be
Right.
incredibly cynical.
Right.
But Chomsky's got this underlying faith in human reason.
Right.
Our capacity to cooperate, to build something better.
And maybe that's why he's so focused on how we're manipulated. Right.
I think there's something to that.
It's like, if you can just break free from these systems of control, that our natural goodness will kind of, like, take over.
Maybe.
Okay, maybe I'm getting a little too,
A little too optimistic.
yeah, hippy-dippy here, but...
But I think there's a kernel of truth to that.
Yeah.
Right? Think about it. Chomsky's really big on social movements.
Yeah.
He points to abolition, the civil rights movement, all these times when people said enough
Right.
and actually changed the course of history.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying that those weren't flukes.
Right.
That's human nature pushing back against injustice.
So it's not about waiting for, like,
right.
the perfect system to magically appear
No, not at all.
or some great leader to come and save us.
It's on us.
It's recognizing that
Right.
we are the agents of change,
Exactly.
which honestly is a lot more responsibility
It is.
than I think I signed up for.
But that's the Chomsky challenge, right?
It is.
He doesn't let us off the hook with easy answers.
Yeah.
He's saying, look, I've shown you how the world works.
Right.
Now what are you going to do about it?
And, it's interesting because for all of his critiques of institutions, he's not saying that we should, like, all go live off the grid,
Right.
become hermits.
He's not advocating for dropping out of society.
Right. He actually seems to believe in, working within the system.
Yeah, I think he believes in working within the system, but with a very critical eye.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's about being aware of the limitations.
Yeah, with this, very conscious awareness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Remember his example about the counterinsurgency research?
Yeah.
He's not saying ban it.
Right.
He's saying shine a light on it, let the public see what's happening, and then decide.
And that's where that whole manufacture of consent thing comes back full circle.
It all comes back to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if we're constantly being
Like,
manipulated.
if the information we're getting is already skewed,
Right.
how can we possibly have an honest debate?
How can we even make informed decisions?
Exactly.
Right. And I think that's why Chomsky is so insistent on this idea of intellectual self-defense.
Yeah, it's like he's giving us the vaccine against propaganda.
Yes.
But we have to choose to take it.
Right. We have to be willing to
do the work.
do the work, to seek out those diverse viewpoints.
Right.
To question everything, to be wary of those easy, comforting narratives.
It's a tall order.
It is.
In the age of the internet,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Where you've got 15-second TikToks and everybody's yelling their opinion.
Yeah, it's information overload.
It's like, how do you even find the signal in all that noise?
Really tough.
Right.
But I think you start by recognizing that the noise exists.
Okay.
That's step one.
Okay.
And then you get curious. Okay. You start asking questions. You seek out sources that you wouldn't normally agree with.
Right.
You test your own assumptions.
It's a lifelong process.
It is a lifelong process.
Right.
And I don't think Chomsky would pretend otherwise.
It's like he's not just giving us information, he's giving us a method.
Yes. A way of approaching the world.
Right. That's skeptical but not cynical.
Right.
Engaged but not overwhelmed.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He's not saying that you have to be an expert in everything.
Right.
But he is saying that you should be aware of the ways in which your own thinking might be limited.
This whole deep dive has been a wild ride, man.
It has.
I came in here thinking I knew Chomsky,
Yeah.
but now I've got all these new, lenses.
A perspective.
Yeah, to look at the world through.
Right.
And they're disturbing lenses in a lot of ways.
They can be.
But they're also kind of empowering.
They are. And I think that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
Chomsky doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
But he does offer hope.
Yeah.
He reminds us that even in a world where systems are often rigged against us,
Right.
the human spirit, that drive for truth and justice, it's still there.
It's still there.
Waiting to be unleashed.
So what do you say, listeners?
Yeah.
Feeling ready to unleash your inner Chomsky.
Go out there, question everything.
Question everything, yeah.
And let's build something better.
Let's build something better.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real mind bender.
It has.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
It never does.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly,
Keep thinking for yourselves.